Hello, my name is Austin Way, and I am the professor of bassoon here at the University of Missouri School of Music. Today, I will be playing excerpts from the set 4 for the Missouri All-State Band Audition. At the end of each excerpt, I'm going to provide some helpful tips to help with your practice sessions. So for the excerpt on page 31, the first thing I want to offer is a recommendation of a drone to practice against. In this particular excerpt, the key does change, but the tonic does not. So you can set a drone to an E for the entirety of the duration, and that will serve you well. If you find there's a particular note in here that you are having trouble placing against the drone, say for instance your C sharp doesn't feel like it's settling and you want to isolate that note, feel free to move your drone temporarily to different pitches within the scale. But I would generally recommend the simplest route in this is to set an E and adjust to it. The reason I would use a drone rather than just watching the tuner is because if you just watch the tuner and if you center everything dead center on the tuner 100% of the time, there's going to be times where you're going to be out of tune, because in order to get pure intervals tuned, we sometimes have to be able to be flexible with the pitch and bend it around a bit. For instance, we start in a minor key, and the G natural in E minor needs to be a little bit sharp to be in tune in a minor scale. When we move to E major, the G sharp needs to be a little flat in order to have an in-tune G sharp in this case. In some cases, it'll be more apparent when we have leaps, like in bar 4, we have an E natural moving to a G natural. That's a little more transparent intonation than when we're moving stepwise. It's a little more forgiving. So you just want to know what you're able to work against. And the drone will give you that intervallic information, as well as tuning your ear rather than training your eyes, so that you can have that to go when you're playing and using your ear just to adjust off of your own intonation. This one is a little tricky because it's not in the best key for bassoon, especially once it moves into E major. It also is going to present basically the same musical material in two different tonal areas. So we have, again, E minor, E major. So you might find different challenges for tuning in different components. For example, in the first few bars, we have a few C sharps, a few D sharps in the mix, but it's largely in the E minor scale, so we have really mostly just F sharp. Those intervals are going to be easier to get through than when we move into E major and we're dealing with these more complicated accidentals. And so you just want to be sure, for one, that you know where your instrument falls, so you know the scale of your equipment. The C sharp in the staff is a real wild card on a lot of bassoons. Sometimes it's really flat, sometimes it's really sharp, sometimes it's really unstable, sometimes it's fine. Hopefully yours is fine. But if it's not, you just want to know where it falls and what adjustments you need to make in order to get it in tune, and also to get it to sounding as comparable to the other notes around it as possible. Same goes for the D sharp in this case. If you have an instrument where the open F tends to be rather flat, you'll probably find that the first finger E and the D sharp E flat just below it will probably be flat to unstable as well. So you might need to manipulate, again, embouchure, your tongue position, maybe even consider different fingerings. On this D sharp, if you're just using the left hand, you might consider adding your second finger in the right hand and the B flat key to stabilize the note as you go. This one is obviously not a very technical etude. Really very few things on this list present major technical challenges. I just marked Andante, as many of these excerpts are. So you want to be sure it doesn't move too quickly. It should be forward moving, and you don't want it to get faster or slower as you go. Be sure the tempo is steady, but not too fast. Allow there to be time for the notes to exist, for plenty of time to connect to each other and create a very good, clear phrase as you go through these different variations. So on page 37, this one, again, is not a major technical etude. It is also marked Andante, once again. So a walking tempo, comfortable pace. This one is also a bit of an endurance etude because of the repeats. It goes on for quite a long time. And we have this sequence that's established right in the first 4 bars, where we have 3 bars of eighth notes, 1 bar of a half note, and that happens throughout the majority of the etude with a little bit of variation in terms of the pacing of the eighth notes, but also a fair amount of variation in terms of the actual notes themselves. The challenge with this one, the first challenge, is to keep the articulation quality consistent from the bottom of the range to the upper part of the range. We don't go very high in this excerpt, but it does get into the mid-range. And in that part of the register, the attack quality is a lot weaker than in and below the staff. So just be sure that you're using a good amount of air behind the tongue, so you have good air pressure behind your tongue before you articulate these notes. That'll give you a stronger attack throughout the register, and to be sure that it stays consistent throughout. The only dynamic indication we have in this is mezzo forte, so I would choose a strong but comfortable dynamic. And again, something that's going to be comfortable and consistent from the low register to the mid-range as well. So you don't want to choose something that's going to be too soft for the low notes or too loud for the upper notes. You want to equalize it so that it sounds very consistent and very in your grasp. And lastly, with this one is challenging because you have a combination of slurred eighth notes and staccato eighth notes. The slurred eighth notes will likely be easier to place in time. The staccato eighth notes, the tendency for most people is to close the distance between staccato notes. In other words, when we have silence between notes, we want to close in those gaps. We feel like we should be constantly producing sound when we're playing. So be sure to let that silence exist so that the eighth notes are just as equally spread out when you're doing staccatos. And same thing when you have the half rests. Let those rests really take their time, catch your breath. You might find you also want to reposition on the reed whenever you get to these half rests. It's very easy for something as long and repetitive like this to gradually scooch up on the reed towards the wire. The peril with that is the closer we get to the wire, that means we're getting onto a stronger, heavier part of the reed, which requires more embouchure strength to control, and it becomes more fatiguing, and also we start to have less flexibility with the instrument, especially in the low register. So if you find you need to be resetting back towards the tip or the middle of the reed, I would practice building that into your practice routine as well, so you know where you want to be going and what part of the reed works best for you. So for the third excerpt on page 47, we finally have something that feels a little more like music at this point. The first excerpt is musical, but it's not particularly exciting or interesting in comparison to other pieces of repertoire. This one has a little bit more development in that we also have some contrasting sections. So there's musical contrast, there's dynamic contrast, there's style that goes into this one. Right off the top, it's marked Marcia, which translates to march. So this is a march style, and for that reason, we can stylize the handling of this dotted eighth 16th note rhythm. What I like to do is lift the dotted eighth quite a lot so that it sounds more focused on the attack than the sustain of the note, which makes the style overall more percussive and more kind of militant sounding as a result. That said, there is a contrasting section in the second line. We have this piano dolce section that happens right after the repeat. That's a great opportunity to manipulate how you're handling the attack quality, how you're shaping the notes, so you can get this momentary, really just about 4-bar contrast to show that you can manipulate those fine details. So that's a really sophisticated sounding thing to be able to project in an audition. It could be a really good way to stand out against people that might just keep it the same way the whole time. That said, the consistency of the rhythm of the dotted eighth 16th note is particularly important. This is sort of an endurance challenge in rhythm in this etude. It's very easy to start off with a very nice dotted eighth 16th, very pure rhythm, and have it kind of melt into sort of a triplety rhythm by the end. Really the best way to practice this is just you need to subdivide 16th notes throughout the entire thing. And you don't need the bassoon to practice rhythm. In fact, I would definitely recommend practicing the rhythm without the instrument. There's a lot of distractions that come with playing the bassoon, getting it to speak, getting it in tune, getting the notes to come out in the right register, different things like that. If you're just looking at the part and just walking yourself through the ta-ta-ta, 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 just through the rhythm like that, in any way you want. You don't have to sing it, you could talk it, you could whatever, you could tap it out, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're just focusing on the rhythm, it's going to give you a purer sense of what's metrically happening within the beats as well. Aside from subdividing 16th notes, I would also recommend thinking of all the 16th notes as picking up to the next note. So picking up across the bar line, across the beat. That'll help naturally delay the 16th note a little bit, since the tendency is for the 16th note to come too soon and to be too long. So it'll help put off that note a little bit and help delay it and send it as a pickup, but it'll also help group the notes more properly, and it'll help keep the phrase moving forward as you're going through this excerpt. And lastly, with this one, you can use a drone of a G throughout. However, there is a momentary passage, that piano dolce section. If you want to move the drone to a B flat, you can reset it temporarily, and that'll give you some opportunity to focus on a slightly different tonal area for those 4 bars or so. So on page 67 for excerpt number 10, this one will handle very similarly to the second excerpt in the set, the one in E flat major. On that one, the second one, you can drone in E flat throughout the entire thing, and this one, similar thing, you can just drone an F through the entire thing. It starts on an F, ends on an F, and that'll give you a good reference pitch as you go. Just like the second excerpt, this one has slurred notes side by side with staccato notes, so same thing, you just want to be sure to not compress those staccato notes. There's no tempo or dynamic indication on this one whatsoever, so I would just recommend don't play it too fast, don't rush it. You want to show that you have very forceful control of your instrument, and you can make it go at the speed you want, precisely at the speed you want. Think of a clock ticking, think of that kind of precision as you're going through this. I would go for an open, full sound, so I wouldn't play this at a really, really soft dynamic. I wouldn't play it at a really, really loud dynamic where the sound starts to pick up some edge. I would find a nice, round, resonant sound that works well for both the slurred notes and the staccato notes, and also for the low F up to the tenor F, so that it's going to be consistent in the same way as excerpt number 2 from different parts of the register and in different notes as well. So for Weisenborn excerpt number 4, this is objectively the most challenging music on the list, not because it's not particularly fast. We're not looking at lots of busy technique in really any of this music, but there are very specific techniques and challenges that go into this etude. Like most any etude, there's going to be really a primary objective that the composer has gone for, and in this case, it's pretty apparent right off the bat from the first interval. This is a register crossing etude for the most part. If you're struggling with getting these slurs to go up, I would recommend revisiting your flicking or venting technique. Either one works fine for this. I think it depends on your instrument and your personal preferences. If you find you're having a hard time getting your thumb to travel to the corresponding, the correct corresponding flick or vent key, just like you can practice rhythm without playing the bassoon, you can practice flicking and venting without playing as well. I would take a moment to hold the bassoon in front of you. You can have it on the seat strap if you want, but just don't have it right up against your face. You want to have enough clearance where you can look down at the key work and see what you're doing. And practice the travel from the whisper key to the flick and vent keys so that you know how to get there, but also keep in mind where you're going on the keys. You don't want to go to a part of the key that is going to be really close to the other key work. This gets a little bunched up here on the bassoon. So you want to find a spot that's more secure. And keep in mind, every repetition of the thumb that you do, going from the whisper key to a flick key, you're building muscle memory. So you want to be sure that you're building the muscle memory that you want in the long run, because you will eventually memorize this distance and you'll keep going back there for better or for worse. So be sure you like where you're going as you're practicing this. If flicking and venting is a completely unfamiliar technique and you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, it's a little complicated to get into for a video like this. So I would strongly encourage you to be in touch with me. I would more than happily explain the technique. It's a very simple technique at its base, but it's just a little complicated to explain the mechanics of how it operates and when to use it, when not to use it, and things like that. So please be in touch. I'd be more than happy to talk about that. One thing that is very easy to talk about right now is a tricky interval in this passage that is not flicked, but it does have a trick to get this upper note to come out, and that is the top space G slurring up to the tenor E. If you are used to having the first three fingers 1, 2, 3, in your right hand down for your tenor E, and if you use that for your slur from G up to E, it's very likely to not work at all. It will probably stay in a much lower partial, and you won't get an E, you'll get something just slightly sharper than a G. If that's happening to you, just lift your first finger in your right hand. In your right hand for the upper E, you just need 2 and 3. And that is just the A tone hole and just the G key, and that's all you need in the right hand. That's a slur fingering for the E. That'll help you slur up and in some cases down to the E. And you can use the same technique on an E flat in that part of the range as well. Another challenge in this particular etude, similar to the march, is we have some rhythm challenges. It doesn't look like we would because it's just eighth notes pretty much the whole time, but there are eighth notes that are duple eighth notes side by side with triplet eighth notes. So when you have these triplet eighth notes that pick up into a bar, be sure that you don't do ta 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 ta. It's all on beat 3, ta 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 da ti. The triplet eighth notes will move a lot faster than you might expect at first. Doing this with a metronome is always very helpful, so that'll help keep your pulse regulated. It's obviously something you can only do to a certain extent because there are all these pauses, these fermatas and caesuras in here, so you'll have to practice without the metronome at some point. But that will be useful, and the drone in this case would be a G. That is something you can keep consistently throughout, and that'll help center your pitch as you go through. When you have these pauses that come up, feel free to set up a dramatic pause and then let it pay off. You don't want to go through the process of setting up a really nice fermata and then just blow right through it onto the next note. Set up some time and give yourself a moment to catch your breath and let the air clear before you move on into the next passage so that it'll be more effective. The silence is really just as much a part of the music as anything else, and it's as necessary as the notes themselves. And lastly, with this one, this is often a lot of young bassoonists' first experience with tenor clef, and it's not a gentle introduction to tenor clef. For two reasons. There's low tenor clef, which we usually don't read. The purpose of going into tenor clef is to eliminate ledger lines above the staff. If we're playing a D in the staff, or if we're playing low, in the bottom octave of the range, it really doesn't make a ton of sense to be in tenor clef, so we don't have it very often. So for example, these Ds in the staff that are in tenor clef, that are all the way in the bottom position of the staff, can be very challenging to read because we're just not used to it. Additionally, this is a difficult way to jump into tenor clef because there are lots of large leaps that happen, leaps of sixes, leaps of octaves. When we're learning a new clef, it's obviously much easier to learn to read scalar motion. If you're playing a C in tenor clef and the next note is a step above, you can assume it's going to be a D. You don't necessarily have to be able to read it. In this case, you do have to be able to read the notes in the clef. What I would recommend, what I always recommend for learning tenor clef, is to make a set of tenor clef flashcards. I would just buy a blank set of index cards and handwrite them. It helps to memorize it. If you write it out, write the tenor clef on one side and the note and bass clef on the other side, or whatever system works for you. And the most important thing is I would not recommend getting a set of index cards and doing every tenor clef note from the bottom of the range to the top of the range all at once. I would start with 3, maybe 5 notes at most, and once you've really memorized those, then make a few new cards, shuffle the new cards into the deck, and gradually integrate some new notes so that you're learning the clef steadily and not being overwhelmed with too much information at once. It'll also make it easier to make the flashcards if you can do just a few at a time. That's going to be simpler. If you want, you could do, in this case, for this particular key, you might make the top space G, the B above that, and the D above that. So that's sort of G major triad just above the staff. And start with those 3, and then maybe build out from there. Or if you want to start broader, you can use the lowest note in tenor clef that appears in this etude, the highest note in this etude in tenor clef, something in the middle, and then just gradually close in from there. But I would definitely start this far in advance. If you have not read tenor clef at all, be sure to not start learning tenor clef the week of the audition. You want to start doing this pretty early on, and you'll want to have it for the future. It'll open up a lot of repertoire. It's very useful to have. It's easier to learn it while you're in high school rather than learning it in college. And the ideal scenario with tenor clef is you want to get to the point where you're so fluent in it, where you're so comfortable reading it, that you don't even realize when you're switching into tenor clef. It's just so automatic that you might be reading lines and lines of music and look at the start of the line and then realize you've been reading tenor clef for a while because you just are so comfortable with it that you don't even have to think about it anymore. If you would like more information about the University of Missouri School of Music or about the Bassoon Studio, please check out our website in the description below. You can find our social media channels by searching for Mizzou Music or Mizzoons for the Bassoon Facebook page, and view past featured performances on the MU School of Music YouTube channel. If you have additional questions about these excerpts or music at Mizzou, please feel free to contact me at the email in the description below, and good luck on your auditions.